O'Reilly, fellow councillors, comrades, ladies and gentlemen, and Irene, I want to thank you. Certainly that's the longest introduction that I've ever heard in relation to me, and I hope they don't put that on my headstone. they'll run out of space if they have to do that. It gives me great pleasure to be back here in Mount Erwin again this afternoon to speak a few words in memory of a great son of South Sligo and a great Irishman, Commandant Michael Marren. And I'd like to thank the organising committee, the aptly named Michael Marren Common, which is based around this locality, for organising this annual commemoration. Some of you may remember that I spoke at the inaugural commemoration here some years ago, and at that time I gave a detailed outline because I thought it was necessary, because there hadn't been a commemoration in memory of Michael Marren for a substantial number of years. I talked at length about the history of Michael Marren and his part in the struggle for Irish freedom, particularly in the Tan War and right up to the truce. And I want to reassure you today, I'm not going to give a repeat performance of a history lesson, but I do think that at the same time we want to take a brief look at the lifetime of Michael Marren. Michael Marren was born here in the townland of Mount Erwin in 1989. He was the son of a small local farmer, and he worked on the farm, and like myself, as Irene said in her introduction, he was also a carpenter, and a very skilled carpenter, I believe. After Easter 1916, Michael became, like a lot of other young Irish people, and indeed middle-aged Irish people, and I'm sure older Irish people at the time, they became focused on the need for national self-determination, and as a consequence of that, Michael J Marren joined the Republican movement, joined the IRA. He was an able soldier, and he was an able leader of men, from any records that are available in relation to him, and there are some amount of written details about the life of Michael Marren. And he was soon promoted to the captain of the Cllr company of the Irish Republican Army. And the Cllr company was part of the 3rd Battalion of the Sligo Brigade. And the Sligo Brigade, I suppose, and it's an indication of the amount of people who were involved in the IRA at the time. The Sligo Brigade, the Sligo Brigade had 3 battalions, and he was part of the 3rd Battalion, which was centred around the Ballymote area. And within the 3rd Battalion, there was 10 companies. And I suppose there could have been anything up to 20 volunteers, or maybe more, but I would say at least around 20 volunteers in each company. And that gives you an indication of the strength of the Irish Republican Army at the time. And around the time of the arrival of the Black and Tans, a full-time company, an active service flying column is what it was referred to in those days, was put together of about 30 volunteers from the 3rd Brigade area. This group was led by Alex McCabe, who subsequently was a TD. He was a Common Gael TD from Ballymote. He was the brigadier, and Michael Marren and Jim Hunt from Borchin, Jim Hunt, who also took the Common Gael side, the pro-treaty side during the Civil War, they were commandants of the flying column. And as the war intensified, they were involved in a raft of military actions, and their area ranged not just around the Borchin area, it ranged basically from as far back towards Sligo as Clooney and into Roscommon, and particularly I would say out towards Ballahadreen and French Park, around that area. They were involved in a number of actions around that area, I suppose in coordination with whatever brigade structure was in that part of Roscommon. But that was their area of operations. And Michael Marren was central to most of the operations that were carried out at that time. And on the 11th of July 1921, after close to 3 years of armed combat against the British, a truce was called. And I suppose a lot of Irish people were pleased that a truce had been called after a protracted military campaign that had probably impinged on a lot of people's lives. And ironically, Michael Marren, who had been on the run for a considerable period of time before the truce, decided, along with some of his comrades, because the truce had come into operation, they could come off the run, and he decided to go to Strand Hill. He was reputed to be a very strong swimmer, and they decided to go to Strand Hill for some rest and recreation period. So they cycled from Gortin to Strand Hill, and the next day Michael Marren was out swimming. And despite the fact that he was a strong swimmer, the tide took him away, because I live in Strand Hill myself and I know this. It's an extremely, and most Sligo people would not be aware of this, it's an extremely treacherous sea there, and he was taken away and his body wasn't found for a significant period of time. So Michael Marren, a man who was wounded by the British during the course of the struggle against British imperialism here in 1920 and 1921, what the British couldn't do to him over a 2-year, almost 3-year period, the cruel Atlantic Ocean done just like that. And South Sligo, and indeed Ireland, lost one of its most courageous sons. And that's why I think it's important that we remember the history of people like Michael Marren, and why we gather and assemble here on a fine Sunday afternoon such as this, to pay homage and respect to Michael Marren as an individual, but to all his comrades, both in Sligo and throughout the length and breadth of Ireland, and those from abroad who supported the Irish struggle. And not just at that particular time, but down through the centuries, right up until the present day. Sometimes, and I just want to say this as an aside, I hear people saying, you know, that we should forget about the past and focus on the future. One of the favourite sayings they have is, we are where we are. How often did we hear Fianna Fáil politicians, for example, come out with that type of a phrase on the run-up to the last general election, and even subsequently to then, and I've heard other politicians from other parties saying it as well. It's a great phrase used by those who would prefer if we forgot about the recent history of the Irish people, and also they use it time after time in relation to talking about people like Michael Marren, talking about Irish patriots. And as an Irish Republican, I'm sure I speak for everyone in this graveyard when I say that we will not forget the sacrifices of people like Michael J Marren. We're proud to come here today, despite all the things that we might have to do. We're proud to come here this afternoon and stand here for 20 minutes, or even if I'm in a good humour, it might go on for half an hour, to stand here and commemorate the memory of Michael Marren. We are proud of our patriots. We don't want to be living in the future, although we have nothing against the future and we want a better future. But we are not ashamed to look back at the sacrifices of the men and women of previous generations and what they have done to try and bring Ireland some form of freedom. Freedom that has been sold very, very easily and handed over to the EU and the International Monetary Fund by the current government and its predecessor. And I say this, shame on those who would belittle such bravery and patriotism. And I would say to you, ladies and gentlemen, that as we stand here today, we should reflect on a couple of matters central to why we have come here. And the first question I would ask, what exactly did Michael Marren and his comrades who fought so valiantly and stand for over the last, what did they stand for when they made their opposition plain to Britain's presence in our country? And secondly, has the hopes of Michael Marren and his comrades and their aspirations been fulfilled now 92 years later after the death of Michael Marren? And in relation to the first question as to what inspired Michael Marren and the thousands of other volunteers in the periods of the Tan War in particular, they're quick and easy to understand if one reads the proclamation and the programme of the First Dáil. And I would say that these two documents should be studied by all Irish Republicans, as they are still form the bedrock philosophy and ideology of today's Republican movement. We all know the answer to the second question in relation to the aspirations that Michael Marren stood for. It's obvious from the current hardship, financial suffering and large-scale emigration that the hopes and values of men and women like Michael Marren are far from being reached. Indeed, I would say that it's arguable in some respects that Irish society is now worse than it was in the early 20th century. People are losing their jobs. More see their only future in emigration. Those left behind fear for their future and what tomorrow holds for their children. Ordinary, hard-working families face the daily fear of how they're going to pay their mortgages and household bills. And I would also say, and we only have to listen to Mr. Dunn in the tapes that have been revealed, that bondholders, bank executives, financiers and developers still live affluent lifestyles. Many are still receiving huge salaries and bonuses, while we, who have had no hand, act or part in bankrupting this state, pay for their recklessness, for their speculation, and we pay for their greed. And I'll tell you one thing. It would absolutely sicken one, and I'm sure I'm speaking for everyone in this graveyard, when you listen to what Mr. David Dunn, the chief executive of whatever grand title he had, of Anglo-Irish Bank, when he talks, when you hear him talking about the way that they played the central bank and the way they played the government of this state during the total debacle that has been the financial meltdown of this state, and that we are forced, every one of us, into punitive taxes to pay off for their carry-on. And there must be something wrong with the Dunns, although there's Fitzpatricks and Fingletons and a whole lot of other people that I could name. But you also hear Mr. Sean Dunn, one of the biggest developers and one of the most reckless developers, who says, from his bolt hole beyond in Connecticut, that he has paid his duty to the Irish taxpayer. He's cleared all his debts, despite the fact that he owes almost €1 billion. Honour of God, what do they think the people of this country are? How can we put up with this rubbish coming from these people? I would also say that after 2 years in office, it's extremely clear that Fine Gael and Labour government has utterly failed the Irish people. Like the Fianna Fáil Green government before them, their time in power has been a succession of failure after failure. They have failed on unemployment, they have failed on emigration, failed on healthcare, and they have failed on the banks. They have failed on education. All they have done there is increased fees, talking about increasing class sizes. They have cut student grants, and they have driven farmers in many cases to the wall with some of their policies. And the only bank that they seem to be interested in taking on is the Turf Bank, where they are trying to drive farmers. That is the only thing that they're interested in doing, is implementing EU diktats and trying to drive people who have traditionally cut turf away from what they have done. And I speak in relation to this as a staunch environmentalist. I believe in the preservation of our environment. But farmers who went out and cut a little turf with their own fire were doing no significant damage, in my estimation, to the environment. And we have seen in our own localities the effects of the lies that they have told. And we have listened to a local minister Minister for Small Debt, and maybe in his case, substantial debt, who told the people before the last general election that in relation to health services, cancer care services would be returned to Sligo General Hospital. And the Labour Party, the defenders of socialism and the defenders of the small farmers, so-called, and the defenders of the working class, so-called, that's what they claim to be, which they most certainly aren't. The Labour Party plastered the county of Sligo, and in particular the town of Sligo, saying that Sligo Regional Hospital, as it's now called, will be the 9th centre of excellence. And I happen to sit on the HSE. It's a forum that we get to ask questions periodically of the officials. And I was assured at the last meeting of the HSE that not only are we going to have a 9th centre of excellence, that won't happen. That not only is the paucity of the delivery of health services in this area so bad, but that women who have to go for mammography will have to continue to travel to Galway for mammography. And yet we have these two parties lying barefaced before the last election to people. And we only have to look back here at Bunanadden. They've closed the Garda station. And God knows, I suppose there's those of you who are at least saying to themselves, a man whose house was raided on a frequent basis by the special branch, it's a wonder he's defending the closure of Garda station. But I am, because that's my duty as a public representative, and I would be failing, and there is no Sinn Féin public representative that wouldn't speak up for the communities. It's wrong that Garda stations are being closed and that people are being forced. Perhaps in Bunanadden it's not so bad because it's relatively close to Ballymote, but people in West Sligo are being forced to go to Ballymote to get policing services. 30 miles away, basically, from Dromore West or Easky. You cannot no longer look to the guards in Ballina, which is beside you. You have to go to the guards in Ballymote. It makes no sense, but it's in line with government thinking of closing down this service, cutting back on that service, and doing away with the other service. This is what we have seen. This is what has happened over the last 6 or 7 years in this country. For us Republicans, and I want to digress here a moment. I meant to do this at the beginning. Irene spoke about the fact that a great Republican from this area, Tom Pilkington, was missing from amongst our gathering here today. And God rest him, Tom sadly died some few months ago. There's also another Republican that I'd like to mention. He was very, very extremely active during the course of the hunger strike, and he was a man that I, during election campaigns and at other time, had great recourse to in the Ballymote area, and that's Michael Healy. And Michael, a couple of months ago, sadly passed away as well. His life had been dogged with ill health, and I want, on my own behalf and on behalf of the local organisation, to pass on to both the families, the relatives of both families, our deepest sympathy on the passing of Tom Pilkington and Michael Healy. For us Republicans, merely coming here to pay respects to a local historic leader such as Michael J Marren should not be enough. To rightfully honour Marren and those who stood with him, Republicans must take the democratic and Republican principles he and his comrades espoused and apply them to the Ireland of today. The task of Republicans in 2013 is to be about our work of developing policies and radical strategies to overcome the evils, national, social and economic evils, which blight the lives of so many of our people. The need for radical political change to make this a fairer country, to break with the past and to make this island a better place to live in has never been clearer. And I would say to this, and this to you, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm sure you will agree with me. Our people are driven mad by the lack of action by the government and the Gardaí to address the crimes of the elite who have hurt us all. And I talked a moment ago about some of those people, the Duns and the likes of Shawnee Fitzpatrick and our friend from Tubbercurry, Mr. Fingleton. You know, when people turn round and they see those people walking the streets, and not just walking the streets, but with their pockets stuffed full of money that they have stolen from the Irish people, and I will put no stone to it. That is what they have done. They have robbed the Irish, this state. They have robbed it in a planned way over the years. And when you see Mr. Fingleton walking away with $1 million of a bonus, in the honour of God, as I said earlier on, what type of a society are we living in? And we are too quiet of a people to put up with that sort of stuff. But I am saying to you that working together, we have the ability to create a better Ireland. But if we are to make progress, we need to start what I like to call a national conversation about what form a better Ireland should take, about how we can start laying foundations for a better, fairer society that upholds the rights of all citizens, not just an elite. We need more radical Republican voices right across Irish society. We need those Republican voices in schools, in community centres, in your homes, and in every other home in this state and country, in workplaces and on the street, delivering the Republican message that politics, and indeed politicians, are not, as they say, all the same. There are some of us who are a wee bit different, and I like to think that we in Sinn Féin are extremely different to your ordinary run-of-the-mill politicians. And we need to show people that there's a better way to run this country and to organise our economy. And within that effort to deliver a Republican message, there's a role for all of us to play. Everybody in this graveyard is here because they have some sense of republicanism or nationalism. And I would appeal to those of you who are in Sinn Féin to continue your efforts. And I know that there has been massive strides made in developing the Sinn Féin party in South Sligo. Now have two extremely strong commons based around what was formerly the Tubbercurry electoral area. And to those of you who are not members of Sinn Féin, I would appeal to you to consider joining the party. As I said, there's a role, as Bobby Sands said, there's a role for everyone to play, big or small, and aged or young. We all have a part to play in disseminating that message of hope to people that there is a better way of moving on and redeveloping our society. So let us leave here today committed to properly honouring those who have fought for an Irish Republic by going out and to endeavouring to make it happen. We owe it not just to the generations who have come before us, but most importantly to the generation like this young person here who is growing up within our society, the generation of 1913, and to the other generations who have yet to come. Let us make the Republic of Michael J Marren, which he and his comrades and subsequent generations of Irish Republicans that they have fought and strived for over the years, let that become a reality. But it will not become a reality without us working hard. So I would ask you, ladies and gentlemen, to take that message with you today. I've held you here. The hurling match is probably starting. You'll not see you might see the end of it. You won't see it all. But I want to reiterate, we have a significant role to play to give real and lasting leadership and to fulfil the views and the aspirations and the hopes of men like Michael J Marren.